Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tamia Jordan, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Director of Intercultural Student Affairs. And I'd like to welcome you to our Tough Topic Tuesday conversation on grief. And today we have some other folks joining us to have a conversation around what grief looks like, especially right now in these days of COVID-19 and this pandemic. So to get us started, a couple of things I want to mention are that we have a slideshow that we're going to share after this that has some resources in it. So we're going to make mention of a number of resources during the conversation, but you'll have access to those and the links to those following the conversation so that you can follow up on them. And if at any time anyone has any comments or questions, you can make them in the chat space. And you can also select to chat directly with myself as the moderator of the conversation. Again, I am Tamia, and we're gonna go ahead and get started. And just so folks know, we are recording the conversation part of this. So the goal is for us to first have a bit of a fishbowl conversation around the topic again of grief, and then to take some thoughts from the chat room and some other spaces after. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. And to do so, I want our folks who are gonna be a part of this conversation to introduce themselves. Julie, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I'm Julie Avis Rogers. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I serve as the campus chaplain and director of spiritual and religious life. And this topic of grief is one that certainly I've noticed in my own life and my own close circle of family and friends, and then amongst our students and whole community. So I'm really glad this conversation's happening.
Awesome. Priscilla?
I'm Priscilla Cheung. I'm one of the staff psychologists at ECAPS.
Awesome. And Jelisa?
Adair. I am a social worker at ECAPS, and I'm also the multicultural specialist through Intercultural. And I'm also really excited to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I want to kick this off by first just talking a bit about like what is grief and what is it in general, and maybe also like specifically how is it showing up during this pandemic?
Yeah, so grief is a natural reaction to loss, and it can be overwhelming emotions. You often hear about the stages of grief. And so they're denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, and depression. And so I think the thing to note about grief is that everyone grieves differently. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. And the stages of grief that we hear about are, I think sometimes people misconstrue it and think that it happens in a linear way. And like once you finish one stage, you move on to another. And that's not what happens. Oftentimes we move in and out of stages. We can go back to a stage of grief, and they're just more like a roadmap. And it doesn't mean that your grief is going to look exactly like that, or that you might even hit all the stages. So I think, you know, kind of understanding that grief is just an overwhelming experience of emotions at some kind of loss.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Are there any ways that folks or that grief is manifesting in particular right now in this pandemic time?
Yeah, I would say that it's showing up in a lot of different areas. Like when I think about our student population, well, actually, before we even get to that, I think as Priscilla started to allude to, when we hear the word grief, a lot of times we think about mourning death specifically. And there's certainly a lot of that happening in this time, especially because our normal rituals around grief are not accessible to us in the same way that they might be outside of a pandemic. And then when I think about different communities, I think that there's different types of grieving happening. I think that for many people, there's the sense of grief around loss of milestones. So for students, that's loss of graduations, that's loss of end of year celebrations to kind of mark the achievements that they will still achieve, but are just not going to be marked in the same way that they anticipated for the last 4, 8, 16, 22 years. I think also there's a huge profound sense of loss of the way things were. And that's pretty all encompassing. And I think a lot of people are feeling that in different ways, of acknowledging that even as we move forward, things are probably not going to go back to the way that they were. And some people can see the benefits of that, like we're going to talk a lot about meaning making later on as another stage of grief, but there's still the sense of mourning of what was. And so that's kind of what I think about when I start thinking about how people are grieving during this time.
I had one other piece to add too, that I'm of a particular form of grief right now being what's known as anticipatory grief, that those that aren't able to say, I had a death in my family or someone is sick, that if there's an unknown future, that can cause a lot of grief too. And I think that can be a really confusing and complicated form of grief, because people feel guilty about that. I shouldn't be sad right now. I didn't even have a loss. Or, but I think to name that when the future is uncertain and things could go wrong, things could be difficult, that causes a very genuine kind of grieving and mourning. And so to know that that's fully okay too. And I think that's one that a lot of people are also experiencing right now and might be confused by.
And I think you touched upon something about, I think what's unique about this time is we're collectively grieving as a society. I think oftentimes when we are experiencing grief, it might be more individual or, within a smaller group of people. And I think what is tricky about right now is we're all grieving to some capacity, different things. And what is hard about grief is oftentimes we can fall into that trap of comparing and saying, like you just said, Julie, well, I didn't, lose somebody right now, so I should be grateful that I have X, Y, and Z or whatever. And I think that's can complicate grief, is when we start falling into that trap of comparing, because everyone's experience is valid. We're all grieving, we're all experiencing some type of loss, and it's okay. We all have our own experiences going on.
And in some ways that makes me think, Priscilla, the very thing that actually could seem like it's a comparison and it's making us so different from one another actually could be the very thing that's drawing us closer to each other. I maybe haven't experienced this loss, but I am feeling that same sadness that someone else might be feeling. It seems like that honoring the grief within ourselves actually makes us more empathetic people.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really helpful to consider all those aspects that you just spoke about. Loss of milestones, the comparison, the guilt that comes with that. And I also know that, even as administrators, that, we're sort of sitting with our own grief as well, and managing our own grief as well. And I'm just wondering if folks can maybe talk about how are you sitting with your grief? What types of things are you experiencing, and how does that look for you?
Yeah, this is such a timely question, because I think yesterday I had what I would call a more grief day. And as Priscilla so beautifully put, these stages that we talk about are so easily able to be moved in and out of. And so when I think about it, it's not even that one has been a prevailing kind of theme for me. I don't think I've really been in denial very much, but I definitely think I've been in bargaining of okay, well, if I stay home, if everybody stays home, maybe we'll be able to, have the restrictions lifted sooner. Or a lot of anger about the specific situations that even brought us to this point. And for me yesterday, my birthday is in mid-May, and just having that realization that like on some level it seems so small, but to know that like this is not going to look the way that I wanted it to or originally intended it to. Ooh. That brought up a lot of grief for me, and seeing other students, I'm working with a ton of seniors right now, knowing that they're not going to graduate, like that also brings up a lot of grief. And so for me, it's definitely been pockets of feeling just more sad, like a lot of the depression feelings, which is really mourning what ideas we had for the future that are not going to happen in the same way anymore. So I would say that that's where I've been recently.
Well, thank you for that. You know, particularly as you mentioned, the idea of sort of flowing in and out of the different stages and things not necessarily happening in a linear way. I know that there's a lot of conversation right now about how folks are experiencing time different even. And so all of that is also a complicating factor, loss of routines, et cetera, things of that nature. Does anybody else want to share anything else about how they're kind of experiencing grief or sitting with grief at this point?
Well, I think might be a good complement to what Jelisa shared, because you were saying, Jelisa, that denial isn't where you often are. And I think I'm holding that one down for you. In that that's sort of my go-to, I think, you know, that I can be like, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And like, that's sort of how I push through. And then, and oh, that's been so true in the last month. Like that's been so true for me, is that that's where I keep going back to, is denial. And I kind of like move through the other ones and then I bounce back to denial again, or hit one and then go back to denial. And for me, I think it's my body that oftentimes like pushes me out of denial. I get really bad migraines, and it's usually, I get a migraine when my body is saying to me like, enough with denial. Like, there's actually a lot more going on right now that you probably really do need to sit with and face. And so that's been my experience, has been bad migraines that are kind of showing me that I need to be moving through, more so than my comfort zone, which I think is denial.
I think for me, and I think you hit upon it, Julie, just in your example, is that I think I'm not sure what stage of grief I'm in, but I definitely move through emotions. And I think one thing that I've noticed is I can get easily frustrated that I still have the same expectation and mindset of how I need to operate, you know, pre-COVID versus now. And I think I need to like constantly remind myself that I need to adjust my own expectations of myself in this time period, and that I might not be as productive, or you know, just getting out of bed and putting on normal clothes, that's like a big win. Whereas, you know, pre this time, that feels like kind of such a minor thing. And so I think the idea of like really having self-compassion, I think that's something that has been a theme for myself in the last few weeks, of just adjusting, working from home, and just even being, you know, recognizing how productive I can or can't be, or redefining what those things mean. Because I think what's happening right now is everything just seems really amorphous, and it's really hard to track like your progress or time. It feels like Groundhog Day every day, and it just feels really like we're in a different dimension. And I think like it just feels really surreal, like my grief, because I'm just trying to like still actively work while being at home, while taking care of a family. And it's just a lot of things that are blending together that I didn't have to do before in such like a intentional way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of folks don't necessarily, you know, think about all the ways that grief manifests, you know, emotionally and physically, you know, headaches, or, you know, not wanting to get out of bed, or, I mean, but also some days, you know, trying to get everything done as well, right? And trying to do way too much, or just enough to keep ourselves busy and distracted. I am intrigued to know. So how there's been a lot of conversations about how folks are making meaning of all of this and sort of where we are and what we're feeling and what this means for who we are as individuals and as a society. Have you all had any thoughts about that yourselves that you'd like to share?
Well, I might jump in by just saying that this idea of making meaning is one that has kind of been added on as a sixth stage of grief, that there's these 5 that Priscilla outlined for us. And then in recent years, this question of, okay, so we've reached acceptance of some situation, but is there anything that comes out of that acceptance? Like, is there any like evolution, any improvement or newness that comes from that grief? And so the idea of being able to go through something really difficult and then like, and what did that actually mean to me? How does that make me a person of more strength or of more wisdom? And so I know, I mean, for me being within spiritual life, that's the area that I'm thinking about so much. And I think that there's pretty amazing potential for that in this moment. And yet I know I've been trying to also just be really okay with the fact that there's probably no one that's there yet, and that's so okay. Like, really, we've experienced an incredible shock to the system personally and collectively. So I think the first thing I would say that I know I'm thinking a lot of is not feeling like we need to have a perfect bow that we've tied on what this means and how it's going to improve us. But I do know that instead of trying to make meaning of it in a big way yet, I've been trying to think of, could I start making meaning out of smaller areas of life as a way to kind of practice being able to then do that when I'm ready or when any of us are ready? So really more intentionally building on reflection on like each day of my life and thinking, today, what actually made me feel invigorated today? Or what were the interactions I had that left me feeling confused and jarred? And so like really practicing making meaning on small levels so that when I get to that stage, maybe I'm a bit more rehearsed or familiar, or my mind's already moving in that direction, but not rushing to that either.
Yeah, I think building off of what Julie was saying, I think the difficult thing about this pandemic is that it is not one discrete event. Like, one thing did not happen on one day that we are now grieving. A series of things has happened and is continuing to happen and will continue to happen for a period of time that we do not yet know what it's going to be. And so I think that meaning making is something that, as Julie said, can happen on a small level, and I think has been happening on a small level for me. But when I think about that in terms of a more collective experience, I think we have to have this event come to a close, and this event has not come to a close. It seems like it is unclear what stage we're even at. And so I just also want to say that so people don't feel like, oh, I need to know what meaning to make of this. No, we're still experiencing it. Like, it is still happening. And having said that, that does not preclude being able to find meaning in the like everyday life. And so similarly, I think I've just really been, I feel like my world has shrunk so small, both in like the geography, like I live in just like a 1 mile radius from my apartment now, but also in the things that, make me happy. Like, I was on the deck the other day and I saw a bird I had never seen before. And like, that was one of the highlights of my day. And that meant a lot to me to have that experience.
No, that I think about just all the ways that we look to comfort ourselves, and and making meaning is a really big piece of that. And finding joy sort of in those, finding joy in the interim, even while things are difficult, is also something that's really powerful for me personally, and joy in small ways. What sort of strategies are you all using? Like, what are some of your, coping mechanisms or resources, or how are you making it through?
I think one thing is that recognizing it's okay to feel conflicting emotions, right? Like I think like we mentioned, like feeling guilty that, maybe we didn't experience a more significant loss or whatever, but also feeling really grateful that we are safe, or you are safe, or you have a place to be. And I think they're not exclusive. And that I think one thing I've been trying to do for myself is to acknowledge and label, okay, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm thinking right now. And also saying it's okay that both of these are overlaying each other right now, that's the reality of the situation, and that's okay.
Yeah, I would say that I am definitely, as Priscilla said, like I'm trying to take note of how I'm feeling and really respond to it. So not trying to hold on to that feeling longer than it wants to be there, but I'm also not trying to chase it away. So as an example, yesterday, as I was feeling really sad, I'm a huge proponent of sometimes just leaning in a little bit. So I had a sad playlist that I put on, and I walked around in the drizzling rain and I cried. And you know what? Like I came back, and it's not that fixed everything. And I was like, oh, great. Like I'm fine with where the world is right now. But it was, to me, really important to acknowledge that emotion and to say, you know what? Like I am feeling sad. I'm gonna lean in order to move through that emotion, as opposed to cutting it off and saying, oh my gosh, look at all these other people who are experiencing so much worse than I am. Like, how dare I be sad in this moment? And so I think for me that has been huge, to just not judge myself for the emotions that I am experiencing and allow myself to experience them to the extent that feels healthy for me in that moment in time. And then also just, I feel so lucky to have the people in my life who I do, to be able to text, to be able to, see via Zoom or Skype or whatever the case may be, and really engage in community in that sense, which has been just so important to me.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to this list, for myself, would be really similar to Jelisa, what you were saying about noticing a new kind of bird and that being like the highlight, of your day. I do think that idea of being so much more aware of the present moment has been so big for me in this time. And just like delighting in really small things that I never would have noticed before. And I'm like gazing at my own plants like a lot more, like within our house, and like, wow, look at that. And that's something I do not do. I'm really someone who's like go thinking about the next thing. So I know I'm finding these pockets of joy in just being okay with wasting time gazing at something. So that's a little source of joy for me.
I feel that's so hard, Julie. I like have this window that I just stare out of. And I feel like I'm becoming my cat. Like we're just both over here like
And the plant piece, I went to Home Depot and stood in line outside Home Depot because I wanted to buy a new plant. I just needed to have more life in my home. And I love this plant. I just look at it and it gives me joy. It's so green and vibrant. So I feel you. I feel like if a leaf shifted, I would notice because I keep staring at the thing. And actually, one thing we didn't talk about is so as Intercultural Student Affairs, one of the things that we do is we focus on supporting everyone, but primarily students of color and LGBTQIA+ students. Are there ways maybe that grief might manifest or be impacting or might look different for those communities? I know that's something we didn't necessarily talk about even before this, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot, as I think about our students, and I worry about them, because it's just what I do. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, my initial thought is 100% definitely. I would say, speaking around the student of color piece, I mean, we know that this pandemic is disproportionately affecting communities of color. And we also know that communities of color tend to be more collectivist communities in the US. And so I cannot overstate enough the importance of kind of centering that when we're thinking about communities of color during this time.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, I won't speak too much of this, but I think also our Asian and Asian American population is likely having a very different grieving process as well, because of the anti-Asian American sentiment that is going on at this time. And these are other factors that complicate our grief, to feel like, yes, we are all grieving as, you know, a society in the world right now, but that grief is not manifesting itself in the same way. And it's also complicated by all of the institutional, just cultural, personal factors that existed before this pandemic happened. And so I think we're still figuring out exactly what that's going to look like in different communities.
Yeah, I that made me think about, I've been reading these stories about, you know, particularly African American folks going out in mass, and right now we're being told to go out in mass, but then it could be more dangerous, especially for, you know, Black men or Black and brown men to go out wearing a mask, because of the presumption of, you know, that they're up to no good already. So those are additional, those are some significant additional complicating factors for how we're experiencing this. And I know that last week we had our call about, we had our Zoom about being LGBTQIA plus at home. Are there any thoughts that you want to bring from that conversation into this one around how folks might be feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about just all the different communities and and individuals who would find home not to be a safe place. Yeah. And, you know, so whether that be, you know, those are LGBTQIA and home is not a safe place, or, of course, you know, interpersonal violence at home. So, yeah, I'm trying to think from our conversation last week. I think that one of the main themes we talked about, especially in that situation, is adjusting your of what is your home base and creating sanctuary within your own body, yourself being a sanctuary, and then what voices, what people are you surrounding yourself with that really can become home and really can become sanctuary for you. So in the case of our LGBTQIA, can you create sanctuary in the close relationships that you have, so that you're not only hearing the hard, the violent, the wrong, whatever they might be, voices at home. So the idea of creating sanctuary was one of our big themes we talked about.
And I would also just add that now that you have brought this into this space, it makes me think about the fact that, like, I don't think there's been enough research or enough discussion about how this pandemic is affecting people in the LGBTQIA plus population, because there are some things that we know statistically about that population that can make them more vulnerable in terms of economy, in terms of just like when you think about homeless youth, like LGBTQIA people are overrepresented in that community. And so one of the things that I fear is that we still don't know exactly who is being disproportionately targeted by this pandemic, because we do know that it's not hitting everyone equally because of a lot of institutional factors, as I said before. But I still think our understanding of that is so limited, and I think it is important that we continue to hold that front of mind of how other populations might be feeling this pandemic.
Yeah.
And sorry, just to
Oh no, please.
I guess the one other thing that I would say is that I think not so much for necessarily the generation I would consider myself to be a part of, but I know for a lot of people, this pandemic is also bringing up a lot of thoughts, memories, historical trauma of the AIDS pandemic. And so also holding that in our minds of how this might reactivate some grief for people who have either lived through that time, know people who lived through that time, and just kind of thinking about how that trauma can be passed on throughout generations and can definitely flare up in this time period as well.
Yeah, no, that's a lot to sit with, but it's really important to, you know, to make mention of those things and to acknowledge that those things are going on, and to center the folks who need to be, you know, thought of and held in a even more sort of thoughtful and tender way while we're dealing with what is certainly a stressful situation for everybody and creating grief for everybody, but is certainly creating specific types of grief for specific populations as well. Are there any maybe so we talked about sort of what we're each doing individually to support ourselves. Are there any resources out there that you all have seen or you know, read or watched on TV or things like that that you would want to put forward before we, you know, come to a close?
One thought I had was, you know, like we talked about, grief can bring up a lot of unexpected emotions, thoughts and feelings, and that it can be triggered unexpectedly, or, you know, there could be something that's particularly, you know, correlated with what's happening and that brings you a lot of sadness or whatever feeling. And it's important. One thing that I think is important to consider too is making sure you take care of yourself physically, because how we're treating ourselves physically has a direct impact on our emotional capacity. And so kind of like self-care things like making sure you're eating and staying hydrated, making sure you're sleeping, those kinds of things. And in terms of resources, ECAPS, our social media, we've been doing a lot of resources and tips on how to take care of your body physically. So if you go to our Instagram or our website, we have those resources kind of listed out.
And I was just thinking about the spiritual side to this, and you know, a couple things that come to mind would be that if you do have any like a connection to for a particular faith tradition, oftentimes I do find that the experience of grief is one that is really held up within sacred texts of lots of different traditions. And I think that kind of knowing how past generations experienced grief and then what came after that can actually be a source of, again, getting a glimpse of making meaning, even if we're not able to ourselves. So that would be one thing I would just offer for those whom a faith tradition is a useful and a positive source for you. And then the second thing would just be that even if you don't consider yourself to be someone who practices a faith or a religion, spiritual practices do oftentimes kind of carve out a moment in the day to take out all of the usual voices and tasks. And so tomorrow for our weekly Wisdom Wednesday, like a weekly meditation that we lead within the Center for Spiritual Life, I'll be leading us through some practices, particularly around grief, that I think hopefully will be accessible and brief ones. So that would be another resource that we're offering within Emerson, and I think applies beyond Emerson too.
Well, thank you. I think that this is a really good point that's in our chat right now about some of the other what's the word I'm looking for? The emotions that go alongside grief, like anger, and how those other emotions manifest, and particularly how certain communities aren't. Or certain individuals are told to sort of suppress different types of emotions, and to sit on them, to sit on sadness, to sit on just whatever it is that they're feeling. Are there any thoughts about that, and maybe any tips about that?
I think that's a great question. And there's not, I feel like that could be its own conversation. We could easily fill an hour with it. And so I guess I more have thoughts than like a cohesive answer.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I'm initially thinking of is that I don't think we give ourselves, well, I'll walk that back. I think, as the question alluded to, there are people whose anger is seen as particularly dangerous. And I think as a society, there's actually pretty like a narrow range of what anger we find acceptable, and an even narrower range of how to express that anger.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that my kind of background as a therapist is really focused on the fact that like there are not bad emotions. There are emotions that are obviously more uncomfortable for us to feel and more uncomfortable for other people to have to sit with, but that in and of itself, these emotions are really powerful because they show us what is important. So if I hear someone saying that they're angry, one of the things I think about is like, okay, so something really matters to you. And I would love for us to explore like, what is that thing that really matters, that is feeling threatened right now, that is that is being activated. And I think that like whenever I hear about anger, the thing that comes to front of mind is like so much of our activism that we've seen in this country was built on people getting angry about something. And when I think about the meaning that we might make of this situation in the future, I think the anger that people are experiencing about how this happened, how things were even beforehand, I think that will be such an important factor in terms of like what we end up with at the end of all of this. And so I don't think I'm coming up with any answers, but more, I guess my recommendation for someone would be what I recommend with any emotion, is sitting with it and saying like, okay, what does this emotion want me to know? Like what if this emotion could separate from my body and be another person and was sitting across from me, like, what would it say? And what does it want me to do with it? Like, how can I honor this feeling? Because I do think in acknowledging it and honoring it and understanding what it wants us to know, that's how we move forward with it, not like run away from it. So those are kind of my top of mind thoughts about it.
This theme that was brought up is one I have not particularly thought of before, and I'm just feeling so grateful for. And to just add to what you were saying, Jelisa, about it, it is just making me think perhaps one other piece to this would be that because so many of us, if not all, have been taken out of our usual routines and communities and like assumptions out of our day, it might be that this is an amazing invitation to do some of that when the world has told us we can't. So, for men identifying folks that have been told like you shouldn't feel your feels, you shouldn't feel sadness, or women who've been told you shouldn't be angry. I wonder if that's part of our work of this time, or part of the invitation of this time when we've been taken out of the world to some extent. So I'm really just feeling grateful to think together.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I know as the moderator, I'm not supposed to be answering questions, but it just makes me think of the idea that, we're sort of living inside of, an imagination or a reality that was imagined by, folks previous to us. And now we have an opportunity to sort of rethink that. reality and to reimagine, you know, how we're going to be and how we're going to move on the other side of this, or even while we're in it. And I think that question is sort of an open call, you know, to that. That's one of those big questions that needs to go on that reimagination, you know, board, and we need to start thinking about it and working on it, because it is true that a lot of us in a variety of our identities have been told that feeling a certain way or being a certain way, you know, is wrong, and that is having devastating impacts on folks in their sort of mental and physical health as they try to, you know, manage through this particular pandemic, this particular situation. So we have to unlearn that in some ways, and we have to sort of unlearn that collectively as a society. So I think that is a really, really awesome thing for us to begin to think about. I'm going to bring us to a close, but before we do, I just wanted to see, are there any last thoughts before we end this thing?
Yes, as we end, I'm really thinking about Julie's last comment in terms of this being an invitation for us to do things differently in terms of processing and responding to our emotions. And I think that that's something that has been kind of like in the back burner of my mind this entire time, but hearing you say it out loud, like, kind of caused it to crystallize in a way that it hadn't before. That one of the things that I know I struggle with is I just feel like I'm so slow at processing emotions, that it takes me so long to kind of move through them. And in our typical daily life that has been really pressured by capitalism, by like this myth of needing to be productive all the time, I felt really like it was an impossible task to actually respond to all of my emotions in a given moment, because there just was not the time and space. And I really love the idea of considering this an invitation to be able to move through my emotions in a way that feels like a good pace for me. And so I just want to thank everybody for all the comments that they put in this space, but I just really like that last piece from Julie really resonated with me.
Well, thank you, everyone. This was a really great conversation that just has me thinking differently about some things as well. And I plan to go back and watch this video and take some notes because I'm grateful for the nuggets of wisdom that this crew dropped. I just want to leave us with a quote, and this quote, it's in the slideshow that will accompany this recording, and it is from Brené Brown, and it says that vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. Yeah, we are spiritual beings, we are emotional beings, and you know, it's okay that we lean into that. It's more than okay that we lean into that. So thank you all. I deeply appreciate you all, and bye.